how's it going? Welcome to the AnvilCast, Episode 2. And today, I want to talk a little bit about world building in video games. Specifically, Final Fantasy. I want to keep the Final Fantasy train going from my last video. I was talking about 15, and I also touched on 12, and I was discussing the newer entries in the series and just how Square Enix have been doing recently. So today I thought it would be cool to go back and talk about some of the earlier games in the series, the ones that mean the most to me. Because full disclosure, I have not played every single game in the Final Fantasy series, but it's something that I probably want to do eventually. I've played pretty much every single entry since 7, and I went back and I played 3/4 of 6 until my memory card fried on my old PS1. I was playing the PS1 version. And I got my data wiped about 3/4 of the way through, so alas, I will have to restart Final Fantasy VI, a notoriously long game. But I will do it eventually. I played a bit of 4 as well, for the mobile. But pretty much since 7, I've been with the series chronologically. I played them as they came out, in order. Up until 13. And I played most of 13. I got very, very far, but I don't know, by the time I'd reached the end, I think my mind had already been made up that maybe this wasn't the game for me. And I'm not really sure who that game is for, but I bowed out of the entire series at that point, and I haven't really looked back. I did play 14 for about a week or so, just to kind of get a sense of what it was really going for, and as I mentioned in my previous video, I'm not really familiar with MMOs. They're just not my cup of tea. So I think a lot of the appeal of 14, it was completely lost on me. I've heard it's actually considered really, really great. For people who love that kind of game, I mean, I've been discussing in the comments in the last video too. A few people have said, hey, 14's great, it's got a great story, it's my favorite story out of the whole series. And that's totally cool. I mean, I think everyone's entitled to their opinions and everyone has their favorites. So yeah, all good. It's just a shame I wasn't able to actually get into it. So, but with the upcoming release of 15, I've been delving back into my childhood with these games, and I just wanted to discuss some of the details here. So, one of the really cool things about the series is the standalone nature of each entry. Like, each installment of the Final Fantasy series takes place in its own universe, its own world, and the world building is reflected by that. Each installment has its own rules, it has its own backstory, it has its own lore, and most of the time they really don't connect to each other. In terms of direct sequels, Final Fantasy X-2 was the first sequel to a numbered entry in the series. And since then, they've had the trilogy of 13 games, 13-2 and Lightning Returns, and that whole chestnut right there. So, yeah, things have changed. But traditionally, each Final Fantasy entry was a standalone experience, and they really had no baggage. I mean, even though they are making a Final Fantasy game in a very, very prestigious series, they still have an immense amount of creative freedom down to the very DNA of the game. When you look at Final Fantasy VI and then you compare it to Final Fantasy VIII, those are two very different games. Both absolutely Final Fantasy games. But today, I kind of want to just focus on the aspect of world building in these games. Specifically, like, which ones do it better than others? Like, which entry in the series has the best example of world building? That ability to ground the player in a world that feels real, or at least takes itself seriously enough to allow the player to really roleplay. I mean, these are RPGs after all. And I find that some of my favorites are the ones that I feel have the strongest world building. The first entry in the series I actually played was indeed Final Fantasy VII, and I must have been about 11 years old when I first played it, so it was a huge shock to the system to go from Mega Drive tier games. I think I had a Mega CD actually at the time. Mega CD/Saturn style era games to something as comparatively complicated as Final Fantasy VII with its JRPG combat system and very, very lengthy story. But, that's the one that got me hooked, so there's a very special place in my heart for Final Fantasy VII, and a lot of my love for the game comes from just the incredible world building. The scale of the world the game takes place in, like, it feels massive. And technically it's probably not the biggest world a Final Fantasy game has taken place in, but something about the pacing of the game actually makes it feel more epic. I mean, even in the first few minutes, you've only just started playing, you get that incredible long shot. You know, I mean, filmmakers have used this technique for years, and Martin Scorsese, I think Orson Welles might have pioneered it, but it's that technique of just, you know, almost containing an entire scene in one long, seamless take. And that's what 7 does, to set up the location, the city of Midgar, to establish that location. You get this incredible panning shot where we start off in the alleyways of Midgar. We pan, we see billboards, we see buildings, we keep panning until we see the entire city, this dystopian cyberpunk city. We get the title fades, and then we keep on zooming, we zoom back in until we eventually settle on the first pre-rendered background of the game, and seamlessly we transition into gameplay. At the time, and this was 1997 we're talking about here, I don't think anyone had seen anything like it, and that's what Square were all about back then. They wanted to push the boundaries and push themselves. This time period was very fruitful, especially for the world building of these games, because a combination of the new technology combined with Square's willingness to experiment ended up giving us a really nice variety of game worlds. And back around then, where you really didn't know what you were going to get. I mean, 6, we have steampunk, 7 is cyberpunk, 8 is a clean utopia almost, 9, classic Final Fantasy, and 10, very, very original. And I want to discuss 10's art direction and world in more detail a bit later. But getting back to 7's approach to world building, after that initial fast-paced introduction, the now classic bombing mission sequence, things start to slow down considerably, and the game really allows you to just soak in the atmosphere, because the whole Midgar section of the game, which is about 12 hours, maybe more, maybe less, this whole section of the game is just completely dripping with atmosphere, and it really sets up the kind of game that this is, the tone. The entire city itself is a microcosm for the rest of the game world, and by the time you actually get out of Midgar, you escape the city, and you see how big the actual world really is for the first time. It's definitely like a mind-blowing moment, and it was for me. Because, at the time, having never played an RPG before in my entire life, just to see that kind of depth was really, really cool. And as you continue through the game and acquire different ways of traveling, and you start on foot, then you move to a chocobo, then you've got the tiny bronco, then you've got the high wind, you're traversing this world in a whole bunch of different ways. And when you couple that with the multiple discs that the original game came on, 3 different discs, I mean, this feels like a substantial experience compared to a lot of other games at the time. And especially now, it is one of the most unique settings in a Final Fantasy, and it's one of the first to really incorporate that sci-fi element. I mean, 6 did incorporate elements of sci-fi. There were mechs. It almost had more of a steampunk feel than a cyberpunk feel. But 7 seems quite content to completely disregard its traditional fantasy roots. And it's a darker world for a Final Fantasy game, to be sure. Many attribute this to Hironobu Sakaguchi's worldview at the time. He recently lost his mother, and I believe that he dealt with a lot of his feelings during this time through Final Fantasy VII. Themes of loss, death, apocalypse, societal decay, environmental decay, but also themes of hope, I think the concept of the life stream, too, gives you an idea of where his head was at. The idea of somebody dying and returning to the planet, becoming one. These are thoughts that go through people's minds when dealing with bereavement. But getting back to the world itself, I think just the density of content really, really, really helped the world building aspect as well. Just walking through the overworld of 7, there's just interesting things everywhere, and just the simple act of exploring the game world is, in and of itself, fun. Whether or not the RPG genre fosters more of a focus on world building, I imagine it does, and that's a discussion to be had for sure. But even when compared to other entries in the Final Fantasy series, 7 really does stand out. When you look at 8, for example, I really love 8. I mean, some people don't care for 8 so much, but I've always really enjoyed 8. I didn't really even dislike it when I first played it. I've always really dug 8. But one of the criticisms I do have for 8 is that the world building is just not quite as spot on as 7 was. The world that 8 takes place in just feels a little bit emptier to me. And because of the way the game's paced, it's very different. You know, 8 starts molasses slow from the beginning and ramps up very slowly to the point where you eventually get into it. It doesn't really have that initial sucker punch that 7 had. But in terms of the world building too, as you branch out and explore the world of 8, you realize that it's actually a lot more desolate than 7. There's just a lot more empty space, and this could have something to do with 8's fairly brisk development cycle. That said, sometimes I feel like that almost works in the game's favor. 8 is a cleaner take on Final Fantasy. It is drier. It's a more modern take on Final Fantasy. So, having that slightly detached feel with the main character being an introvert and just the very striking art direction of the game, I think maybe that desolate desert feel that you get from certain areas in the game, there's an aspect of that I can definitely dig. And it's a more realistic world, a more European world. Square have gone on record for saying that they were going for a more European look with Final Fantasy VIII, and this is really reflected in a lot of the architecture of the game. A lot of the game's cities feel distinctly European. And for me, I mean, I love the art direction of 8. I'd say it's one of my favorites in the entire series. The game's extremely stylish. And even if the game world doesn't feel as detailed as 7, it does, to me anyway, it feels more consistent, especially in design. And if there is one criticism I do have for Final Fantasy VII, it's that visually it can be inconsistent from time to time. An example being the more realistically proportioned character models for the battle screen, looking completely different to the super deformed chibi character models that you control for the vast majority of the game. 8 has more of a unified vision for its art direction, and I can really appreciate that. It's really cool. And it's another example of the way that Square were pushing themselves during that time period. I mean, they went from 16-bit pixel art graphics to Final Fantasy VII, their first 3D rendered game, to 8. And suddenly we have realistically proportioned characters and incredibly detailed pre-renders. And for me, this is why Final Fantasy VIII is one of my favorites. And I think that the writing can be a little iffy at times, but the fantastic translation that 8 received really did it a lot of favors. And, coupling that with the fantastic art direction, it's great. But just as everybody has, their favorite entries in the series, each one seems to approach the entire idea of world building slightly differently. Final Fantasy X completely omitted the idea of a world map over which the player would traverse the world, I mean, every single Final Fantasy has had a world map up until 10. And that, for me, definitely hurt the world building in 10 because it's very visually striking, it's very colorful, almost psychedelic, and we're using bright tropical colors here with 10. It has a very cool feel. I love the tropical feel of 10 with the super colorful menus and just the beaches of 10. It's really interesting. But the omission of an overworld, a traditional RPG overworld, it takes away that sense of adventure and exploration that every other Final Fantasy game has included in some form or another. Final Fantasy VI's overworld was just absolutely stunning, even as a 16-bit SNES game. The Mode 7 pseudo 3D presentation of the overworld is still pretty impressive. Being so fond of the world design of 10, It's such a shame that we weren't able to explore it in the same way that we'd become accustomed to up to that point. Because although I really did enjoy 10 quite a bit, the more linear approach to world building and the lack of a larger explorable world, it hurt the experience slightly for me. I mean, it's still a great game though. And despite lacking a world map, it still does a great job of establishing its own setting and introducing its own lore. As I said before, the world of Spira is a very tropical, very bright, colorful place, and it's a place you'll want to spend time in, you know? But on the subject of the overworld maps that Final Fantasy has presented us over the years, I think one of my favorites has got to be the one from Final Fantasy IX. Now, Final Fantasy IX is such an interesting entry in the series. Unlike a game like Final Fantasy VIII that looks to the future in terms of its philosophy, Final Fantasy IX is more reflective. It's a love letter to the classic era of Final Fantasy, the NES era. It was the last game that series creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, worked on before leaving the company. And I can't help but feel like this played some kind of part in the conception of the game. I feel like he must have known this would be his last opportunity to direct a Final Fantasy game, and what we got was a celebration of everything that Sakaguchi loved about the series. In terms of world building, 9 is also another extremely strong entry in the series. The world of 9 is incredibly well realized. It takes the consistency of 8 and then takes the design and goes in a completely different direction with it. In tune with the more reflective, more nostalgic vibe of 9 comes a very, very, very unorthodox art style. It's kind of a storybook kind of feel, and it works very well for Final Fantasy IX. And that is a key point. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of the art style, but whatever dark place that Sakaguchi was in with 7, he seems to be much more optimistic when you take a look at 9, and this makes for another really, really unique game. The thing I love about the world of Final Fantasy IX is it's so incredibly imaginative, and it is so incredibly a fantasy setting, and yet it still follows some kind of internal logic that really, again, I just appreciate. Overworlds in previous games were largely flat affairs. The overworld of Final Fantasy IX has a certain verticality to it, and that plays into both the gameplay and the actual lore of the game. I mean, take the concept of mist, right? Like, mist is this strange, persistent fog that covers a lot of the geography of Final Fantasy IX. And gameplay-wise, the mist was an indicator that there would be monsters in the area, and monsters are actually born from the mist. That's the lore explanation. All of the major cities in the game are located on high plains above the mist, obviously. All forms of travel involve airships powered by mist engines, so people can actually get around safely. And when you go down into the mist, you know that you're going to have to be doing some battling, and it gives it a certain atmosphere. When you're above the mist, things are a little bit more relaxed, and it's a satisfying rhythm, for sure. Nine's world is more of a traditional fantasy setting, although it does have a lot of elements of steampunk. It's mist punk, if you will. And it tried a lot of really interesting and unique things with the pacing in the story and the world and pretty much everything, while maintaining this very, very, very pleasing sense of nostalgia. Especially gameplay-wise. I mean, this was a nice traditional FF battle system, still unique, but very, very influenced by systems of the past, especially the earlier entries in the series. And I could talk about 9 for hours, but I'll just say that, yeah, it really does have a exceptionally well-designed world, and it could be my favorite. I think it could be my favorite. If you were looking for an example of an entry in the series that I think has bad world building, I'd probably have to go for the endless hallway that is Final Fantasy 13, and I will make a completely separate video on 13 because I played a lot of it. So we're 20 minutes now, so I'll wrap it up. But before I do, just a quick shout out to user Son of a Glitch for a pretty awesome comment on my last video regarding the different eras of Final Fantasy. The first Apprentice era being Final Fantasies 1 through 5, the second Master era being 6 to 10, and finally the third Lost in Trend Chasing era, Final Fantasy 11 to 15. And I gotta say, I have to agree with this assessment pretty much 100%. Anyway, okay, cool. This has been Anvil Warface. I will catch you next time. Later.